for us. For educationalists, we make our living from education and from the school, and many of the issues I want to raise are perhaps challenging for us both as practitioners and as parents. I'm going to try and reduce the argument to 10 particular points. That'll involve some crudity and some schematic skating over issues. But I'll try and reduce the arguments in that way and spend about 20 minutes as Geraldine suggested. I hope I'm still there. I've got somebody else on my screen now. Can you still hear me? Yeah? Okay. The first point, the basic point I want to make is that we constantly and repeatedly confuse and elide education with schooling. Essentially, we take education and schooling to be the same thing. We find it enormously difficult to think education without the school. We're constantly attending to, defending, improving, elaborating, questioning the school, and we take that to be what we understand as education. And I want to separate those things out. And in part, I want to do that because I take it as obvious that schools are, for many young people, very unhealthy, discriminating and alienating places. In many senses, they are intolerable. They are unfair systems of categorization and the production of intelligibility through which young people come to understand what they are and what it is they might become, which are unsuited to the needs of the future, if there is to be one. Schooling is part of a regime of intelligibility. We can increasingly only think about young people in some kind of relation to the school, be that a positive one or a negative one. They are categorized, organized, and related to in terms of their relation to the school. And in thinking about the school, we constantly and blatantly misread or ignore the history and purpose of schools. We reread that purpose in positive terms, and yet in their modern form, schools as institutions were established for the management of the population. And essentially, that is still their primary role, to manage the population. They were created in their modern form in the early, late 19th century in response to the movement of large-scale population changes from the countryside to the city. The city became a site which was politically, economically, religiously, ethically problematic in terms of health, in terms of behavior, in terms of criminality, in terms of the relation between the population and the state. And the school came to play its part in the management of those relations and the management of that new urban population. Furthermore, I believe, and I would argue that schools are irredeemable, that basically they may remain locked into their primary purpose and function. We've seen 200 years of so-called school reform, so-called school improvements, and we're currently living through an intense period of school reform, with enormous resources being devoted to making the school more effective in various ways, whether that is viewed as performance and performance outcomes, or it's viewed in terms of fairness and justice. But the history of reform, the history of improvement, is a history of constant failure. And the idea of a fair and just school is essentially a fantasy, what Brennan calls a foundational fantasy. We find it impossible to think about schools in ways that question the possibility of justice, the possibility of fairness. And yet, in terms of their purpose, in terms of their function, justice and fairness are irrelevant. In fact, they may be an obstacle to the base functioning of schools. Because schools are essentially Enlightenment institutions. The school is an Enlightenment institution par excellence. It is one of the key sites in which the tyranny of rationality was fostered and established in the 18th and 19th centuries. And it's one of those sites where the confused unity between care and control is played out. We give over our young people, our students, our children to the state to control and care for. That is our Enlightenment deal, in a sense. We accept the reasonable politics of the state on the basis of an exchange of that for equity, for progress, for stability. And the school is one of the key sites where those relationships between rationality and politics are played out. The school is based on the optimism and hubris of the Enlightenment, which synthesizes a set of ideas around God and reason, nature, science, and humanity, and a common European civilization that provided and provides political and moral legitimacy for the exploitation of nature, for colonialism, slavery, multiple inequalities, and what Catherine Yusuf calls the politics of non-life, the division between those who must be let live and those who can be let die. And I can come back to what I mean by that perhaps a little later. So the school is currently, in its current iteration, one site in which the global petro-economy is proselytized, and the duality of a highly individualized humanity and a collective inhumanity is daily reproduced. That's what Anna Kleamter calls the petro-pedagogy, an education steeped in fossil fuel dependence and extractive logic. And in that way, the school is both subject forming and terror forming. It's subject forming in the sense of producing a particular kind of extractive, unsustainable subject. And at the same time, it produces a particular relationship to the earth, to the globe. It changes the globe, it changes the climate, the soil, the airs, the sea, and changes what it is to live in that environment. In that sense, the school remains very much a colonial institution, both in form and in content, and is complicit in the determination of certain dehumanized bodies as dispensable. And crucially, the school ethically hails a humanist subject that is the praxis of extinction. It is contributing to the extinction of our species. And part of that, as I've said already, is defining and relating to nature as infinitely exploitable. And that is not interrupted by any kind of sustainable educational programs. The subject of schooling, the subject that school produces is embedded in, immersed and immersed in the structures of thought which produce exploitation, waste, and excess. And also at the same time, it contributes to the reproduction of a geologic of settler colonial modes of production. So what I'm presenting here is not a critique of the bad school or the failing school or the neoliberal school, but a critique of the modern school and its machinery and practices to its core, entirely and totally. What I'm proposing is the erasure of the school and the necessity of that erasure. Spaceship Earth is, in fact, as we know, in deep trouble. And saving the planet, if that is not too late already, will not be achieved by more recycling, or certainly not more economic growth, which is perhaps the major contributor to the situation we find ourselves in. And certainly not more school gardens or a highly depoliticized education for sustainability, or more sustainable goals that focus mainly on humans rather than nature, as is the case with the United Nations sustainability goals, or more avoidance of eco-anxiety. We're not supposed to make children anxious about the future and thus pretend that things are never quite as bad as they might seem. And nor indeed in relation to all of that is more schooling going to be helpful here. Indeed, my point is that schooling is compounding and contributing to the climate emergency rather than playing any role in combating the climate emergency. It is making no positive contribution, and indeed, it is actually making things worse. So my conclusion from all of that is that if we are to construct a future of any sort and avoid our extinction as a species, if that is not too late, then one thing among many others that we must do is abandon the idea of the school and erase it from our thinking about education, that we must think about education in the space created by the absence of schooling. The eradication of the school as the center of educational thought would be then an opportunity to rethink education differently, or to think education differently. And I would see that as creating the opportunity for education as an ethical project of self-formation. I don't want to preempt that space. I want to fill that space. I have ideas about what that space might look like, but it is not for me to determine or predict what any kind of different education might be. But as I see it, it should be an ethical project of self-formation, of limit testing, transgression, and permanent skepticism. That education should be about questioning the truth rather than learning it. And that education should be made up of, should take place in multiple sites that are devoted to, at least in part, the development of agentic skills that are relevant to the problems that we face, the poli-crisis that we now inhabit. So what I'm saying is that there's no straightforward program to be outlined here, or I don't have a program to be outlined. I have ideas that I would want to argue for, but rather this is the starting point for experiments with the possibility of the impossible. Not a foreclosure, not a defined liberation, not a normativity in terms of what would be a different kind of moral, economic, social position, but rather an openness to an engagement with the possibility of being different, and the creation, an opportunity of a space for self-formation. And what I mean by that is a different kind of relationship to ourselves, to others, and to the planet. It would, the ethical projects of self-formation would rest on those three elements, and they would be of crucial and interdependent importance: a relationship to ourselves, relationship to others, and a relationship to the planet. And this would involve going beyond what Sylvia Wynter calls man too. I've been very taken recently with the work of Sylvia Wynter. It would involve a counter imaginary for education and a new schema of perception. And it would possibly lead to something we might call an ecological subjectivity, a subjectivity that involves a very different relationship to nature and to ourselves and to others. So in all of this, there's no perfect solution to the complex mess that the planet is in right now, but there may be some better directions. But one thing I'm very clear about is that the schooling has no positive contribution to make to those new directions. Mm-hmm. So those are my 10 key points, and I'd be very interested to know what people think and how they might respond. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you. I'll stop the recording now, and if I can manage to find the button, I can. Lovely. And stop the